Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video of History Vibe Podcast. Today I'm joined by Dr. James F. McGrath, and today we're talking about his book called What Jesus Learned from Women. So welcome back to the show, James.
Thank you so much, Jacob. Always a pleasure talking to you.
Likewise. So let's get started. So let's just start with this. You talk about when Jesus encounters women like, say, Mary and Martha of Bethany, for example, and others. Many will try to say that, oh, Jesus didn't learn anything from women. What are you talking about? He's he's part of this big giant man-only movement following Torah orthodoxy. Why are you even bringing up women's involvement here? But what did he actually learn from Mary and Martha and others? Because he does point out that he goes to them. One of them pours oil on his head, and he seems to be quite conversant with them and seems to be very receptive to what they have to say.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great way of putting the question. And don't want to forget to come back to what you mentioned there, the conversing with them. Let me emphasize that when we get, for instance, in the rabbinic tradition, some rabbis who say, best not to, talk to women, best not to teach Torah to women, things like that. There's more than one way of taking that, right? Just like we encounter things in the Christian tradition that say similar things. And sometimes that might be maintaining a status quo that's reflected in what's said. But sometimes it's, wow, everybody is moving in this direction and we don't like it or we're not comfortable. And ideally, here's what we think people should do. And so I say that because there's a risk, particularly of, I think, Christians or non-religious people towards religious people, but any group saying of another group, oh, look, they're all misogynistic, they're all like this. And I think just about every group has problems with patriarchy and misogyny, at least every group that I've encountered. And there are streams within just about every group, unless it narrows itself very, very, in a very, very limited fashion, that are more inclusive, more egalitarian, and so on and so forth. And so that said, we get the sense in stories like the one about Jesus encountering the Samaritan woman at the well, that Jesus, at some point, right, early on, did not make a habit of talking with women. And that was one of the things that prompted this book project, was the disciples coming back according to the story, right? Whether it's fictional or factual, it's intending to reflect the kind of thing that would have seemed plausible, right, at the very least. And according to the story, the disciples come back and it says, none of them asked, why are you talking to a woman? Which, they wouldn't have had that question if this was Jesus' regular practice. And so by the time we encounter Mary and Martha, these two sisters in Bethany, Jesus seems to make a habit of talking with women. And that may reflect development, something he's learned as a result of his experience. And in that story, we also see a woman taking initiative and it having an impact on Jesus, right? We're not told that Jesus invited Mary to sit at his feet and become his student, his disciple. Jesus doesn't say in response to Martha's complaint that Mary is not helping her with the things that are the usual female duties in that culture. Jesus doesn't say, well, my teaching, you should be sitting here and learning from me too. He says, Mary has chosen the better portion, the better part, and I'm not going to take it away from her. And so in putting it that way, he indicates that it's her initiative. And there's presumably something about him that made her feel like she could do that. But she's doing something that has not been the custom and which Jesus had not invited her to per se. And that, I think, is interesting. And I think that those of us who are interested in Jesus as an actual human being, right, which oftentimes gets overshadowed because of Christian doctrine and things like that, but also who are interested in how this movement that existed in a patriarchal culture, but patriarchal culture doesn't mean that there's nobody with more egalitarian tendencies, things like that. How does this movement give birth to at least some strands of tradition that were more egalitarian, right? That we see in the Acts of Thecla, that we see in the Gospel of Mary and things like that. And I think it is stories like this that give us a glimpse of how that came about, because the fact that some strands were more patriarchal doesn't require explanation, right? It's the ones that are bucking the status quo that really need an explanation. I think it's encounters like this that tell us how Christianity got there, but more importantly, how Jesus, as an actual human being and as an actual historical figure, might have gotten there.
When you look at texts like the Acts of Paul and Thecla, because like some scholars think that there may be some real history in those texts that go back earlier, but others would say, "Oh, it's all fiction and made up." Completely ignore it. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not advocating taking it as history, right? There's the possibility of some recollection, right? There's the description of Paul with his unibrow and things like that, which I think may have been more flattering in an ancient context than it seems to us today. Not having one myself, I'm sort of consider that a good thing, but on the other hand, Paul, is described in that text as seeming like an angel at times, with his unibrow and all. So maybe all angels were like that in the thinking of the author. Who knows? Anyway, but there are details that certainly didn't need to be included, and sometimes people have thought might reflect actual reminiscence, but it's largely a novel, right? It's largely what we might call historical fiction. And the only question is, is anyone in there other than Paul an actual historical figure? And if so, is anything other than their names used? And those are questions that historians can debate. And because these texts are somewhat later, it's a lot harder to tell than in some texts that are closer in time to the individuals and the time that the story is set in. But I'm not referring to it as giving evidence of the life of a historical Paul or a historical Thecla. All I'm saying is that in that text, we get evidence that there was a form of Christianity in the 2nd century, at least, and maybe into the 3rd, where women and men were giving up on marriage and sex, and that celibacy was understood to level the playing field, make things more egalitarian, right? Especially as women refuse to conform to the usual roles of wife and mother. Often women who did not have those responsibilities, those roles, the relationship to another male authority figure in this patriarchal context, did have a measure of additional freedom and authority and whatever else. And so all I'm saying is that there was a strand of Christianity, maybe more than one, I think, that was more egalitarian, right? Vis-a-vis what some more patriarchal strands of Christianity were doing in the same time period. Tertullian, right? And probably the pastoral epistles seem to be responding to, if not the written acts of Paul and Thecla, the kind of view on women, on marriage, on other things that we find in it.
Do you think that this tells us anything about what the historical Jesus did, like how he viewed women or how he dealt with other males in his movement when he tried to interact with women?
I think it does. And one reason for that is that, it's a combination of things. One is that on the one hand, we don't have any apparent interest of any of these earliest gospel authors in showing Jesus as learning things. There's a lot of interest in him as an authoritative teacher, someone that speaks, has heard from God, who speaks authoritatively. And where a modern day biography, even of an authoritative figure, would be interested in, okay, but how were their views shaped? Who influenced them? Ancient biographies, even, to say nothing of historical fiction and other genres, are not as interested in that as we are. And so we find these things in multiple sources, right? I mentioned a story in the Gospel of John that seems to have this as a feature. The story of Mary and Martha is in the Gospel of Luke, and it doesn't appear in other Gospels, but it has this feature. And when we see this popping up in multiple sources, and it's not something that any of these authors is emphasizing, those are the kinds of things that historians tend to think are simply coming through from earlier tradition and from historical knowledge. And so I think a good case can be made that regardless of whether the details of the stories are historical, regardless of one's judgment on how much of each individual story may reflect something that actually happened, how much of it is, persons and events may have been dramatized, as it's turned into a biopic, of an ancient sort. That's not really the question, right? The question is, does it give us some historical information? And I think the fact that this facet comes through in multiple stories, in multiple sources, each independently, is the kind of thing that provides as strong an indication of historicity as we can hope for from ancient sources.
And what do you make of the scenario when Jesus encounters another woman and he refers to her as daughter? What's that about?
Refers to his daughter.
You mentioned in the book that Jesus calls the young woman experiencing puberty and traumatized
Right.
little girl, a woman of status who was at least old enough to be the little girl's mother, he called daughter.
Yeah. So there's these two women in this, what really is one story, but it's a story about two women, and it has the form of what's sometimes called a Markan sandwich. Right? The Gospel of Mark likes sort of starting one story and then inserting something in the middle and then going back to where it started. And what we actually get is this young girl, right, who's 12 years old and is at the start of the story, is dying, and the flow of the story is interrupted by Jesus' encounter with a woman who reaches out and touches the hem of his garment, seeking healing from some sort of vaginal bleeding, and so she has some sort of condition, and she's had this for 12 years, right? And so there's this interesting connection between the story of the girl and the story of this woman. And in the one case, right, we have somebody who is presumably somewhat older and who's suffered with this, at least since puberty, right? And the other girl is sort of reaching that age, and so we have these two people who are experiencing complications of issues related to things specific to women and their experience. And I think Jesus' empathy with women, the way he speaks to this woman who may have been suffering as a result of the trauma of puberty, maybe been the only child, not very clear on what's happening to her body. And there may have been people in the community who were concerned about purity and other issues as well that may have been a factor in things. And this other woman who has been suffering, presumably unable to conceive, has been spending a lot of money on doctors, presumably unlikely to be married given that she's suffering from this condition. And in the one case, Jesus addresses the girl as little girl, and the phrasing in at least some of the gospel manuscripts is such that it reflects the pronunciation of Galilean Aramaic, and some manuscripts correct that, right, so that it becomes, instead of Talitha Kumi. The only reason for it to have the other form is that somebody actually remembered what Jesus said, or perhaps is close enough to the time and place that they know how Galileans pronounce things, right? It's more likely that somebody corrected it to the correct form than somebody changed it later on, especially as Galilee becomes, and the way Aramaic is spoken there becomes something that fewer and fewer Christians and authors and scribes are familiar with. And so you have this woman who's suffering for 12 years being addressed as daughter, and sort of in this kind of youthful way. And we have this woman who's suffering, and perhaps traumatized by the onset of adult womanhood, addressed as little girl. And these features of the story, I think, are indicative that it's being told as essentially one story with two major female characters in it. So is that what you wanted to know about that story? Or?
Yeah, that answers that nicely. Now, how do you respond to those that say, well, when Jesus approached a Canaanite woman, and this is one of as the Gospels talk about, or one of them does, he calls her a dog. So what's the deal there?
Yeah. So when you said daughter, I wanted to make sure. I was like, did you say daughter or did you say dog? Right? Because they both start with the same syllable, and sometimes the
Okay, I
internet
got
gets
it.
a little choppy
Yeah.
or something. You're not entirely sure. And that's the story that most people go to first, which was why I just want to make sure that wasn't the story you were looking for me to talk about before I started rambling on about a different story than the one you asked about. But if you ask people, who did Jesus learn from, right? There's his mother, right? If you assume that he's a human being, if you treat him as a genuine human being, then you learn from his mother. But even beyond that, maybe even more so than that, the one story in the Gospels that most scholars and a lot of people would say indicates Jesus learning something from someone is the story of the woman who's said to be either Syrophoenician, right, from the area of Tyre and Sidon, right, in Phoenicia, or Canaanite, right, which is more or less the same thing, right? Person from that part of the world, if they're a native of that area, is Canaanite, right? Phoenicia is just the city-states and the civilization that was the Canaanite civilization that was located in that area. And so she belongs not just to a different people group than the Israelites, but one that was historically hated, right? Comes across in the Jewish scriptures, right? The land is conquered by the Israelites and taken away from them. They never conquered Phoenicia, obviously, but even then, Phoenicia serves as a sort of thorn in the flesh of the nation. The prophet Elijah stands up to Ahab and his Phoenician wife, who is essentially advocating for and being accepted, having her national god worshipped alongside Israel's national god, right, as sort of like co-equal deities, or at least both being given focus. And so there's lots of antipathy, there's lots of dislike, of distrust of Canaanites and of Phoenicians in the Jewish tradition and scriptures. And so Jesus calls this woman a dog. And there are lots of things I learned as a result of working on this book, in the case of every single story. But in this one of the things that really struck me that I didn't know before was that in Phoenician cities, they've occasionally found like dog cemeteries, right? And there's this interesting question of whether dogs actually were particularly appreciated by this culture. Be that as it may, it's a story that disturbs a lot of people who hold Jesus in high esteem because he's disparaging to this woman. He's insulting. No matter how cute you think dogs are, no matter how much you think Jesus is referring to cute little puppies, saying that your own people are children and others are some sort of animal, however cute, is insulting, it's dehumanizing, and it's something that offends us, and rightly so. And what's striking in the story, right, apart from Jesus' behavior, right, which surprises some people who are not expecting it from him, is that the woman has this clever comeback, right? She says, when he says it's not appropriate to take the children's bread and give it to dogs, after she asks for her daughter to be healed, she could have, I'm sure she was angry, I'm sure she was upset, but she manages to come up with this clever retort even so. Even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the children's table, which I don't think is just saying, throw me a scrap. I think it's saying, if you don't let those that you consider dogs catch, a few bites of something underneath the table, if you're deliberately withholding even the scraps from them, that's not prioritizing the children, that's cruelty to animals. And so she manages to come up with this saying on the spot while angry because he's insulted her and her sick daughter that she wants to see healed, right? So this is an angry mother, right? And she manages to come up with this clever comeback that, according to the story, persuades Jesus to, in fact, heal the daughter. So most interpreters would say she bests Jesus in an argument. And she's the only person who does that in any of the gospel stories. And so, very significant person. And why would this story that has Jesus behaving in a way that some might call, unchristlike, to be facetious, Why would this be included in the Gospels? Again, because maybe it was a decisive moment that changed how Jesus viewed people from outside his own people group. And it was remembered as such, and the story was told. So, yeah, I think it's a very significant story in relation to the theme of the book, but also in relation to thinking about Jesus as a genuine human being who learned.
What was the last thing you just said? I'm sorry.
So I think it's an important thing in relation to the theme of the book, right? What Jesus learned from women,
Right.
but also just in general in terms of thinking of Jesus as a human being who learned, whose thinking on subjects developed, who didn't just have thoughts that were downloaded from heaven in their final form or something like that, whatever people imagine, right? When they imagine Jesus as somebody who never needs to learn anything. This is a significant story, I think, from every perspective.
So when you talk about that, what Jesus learned from a defenseless young woman accused of adultery, could you elaborate on that?
Yeah. So there's a story that's not in our earliest manuscripts of the Gospel of John. It shows up there later. But it seems to have been a widely known story. And so was it originally part of the Gospel of John? Probably not. Could it be based on something that actually happened? Quite possibly. So those are two separate questions. But what's interesting in relation to the theme of the book, I think, in particular, is that most readers of the story assume that the accusation brought against this woman is straightforward, she's guilty. And yet the accusation that's brought is she's been caught in the act of committing adultery, and she's there on her own. And often this is mentioned, but people come up with lame excuses like, well, the other person, they're protecting him because he was a prominent person, or they just didn't manage to catch him, or something. It's like, none of that seems to hold water. There are other issues with how this story is often envisaged, right? I've seen like TV depictions where they're actually there, they bring her, they drag her out to a field somewhere, they actually have rocks in their hands, they're ready to stone her, and then it's like, well, but let's ask Jesus. It's like, what are you going to ask him at this stage? Why, right? And sometimes what Christians have done with this text, right, that's really appalling, is they've said, they've depicted the Jewish mob, as it were, as wanting to kill this woman, and saying, let's see if Jesus does the right thing by our standard, which is to uphold the law and kill her. Right? And all of this is problematic, both in terms of the anti-Semitism, right, that's reflected there, but also historically. It says that the Pharisees, right, were the ones who bring the case to Jesus in the temple courts, right? So this is a genuine sort of investigation and consulting another authority. They might want to trip him up, but if they're asking in the temple court, this is not a stoning about to happen. Right? And the Pharisees, Josephus tells us, were famous for wanting to avoid the death penalty whenever possible. And we get that in the rabbinic tradition. Like there's case after case where they find a loophole to avoid the death penalty. And so if this was brought to the Pharisees, it's not in order to get, have the girl executed. You could do that. You could just say, look, she's guilty and we're going to deal with this, right? There's no criminal justice system like the kind we have today. If it's been brought to the Pharisees, somebody is looking to get the girl off. And so there's some kind of complication here. And yet we're not told what it is. And so the story then becomes, we realize, something of a whodunit, right? It's like, what's the story? How do you get this girl off? And they're testing Jesus' ability by bringing him a difficult case that apparently, they have not found a satisfactory resolution to. But then they don't give him the information. And so we as the readers also don't get the information that might have helped solve the case and find a standard legal solution. And we get the sense that Jesus perceives this, and so he takes the time to think about it. And while he's doing so, he's drawing, doodling, writing, doing something on the floor of the temple there. And the fact that it's the floor of the temple, I think, is important, because this is a place where you might have some dust, but you also have a lot of people passing that way. And we found mosaic tiles from that era. And so the floor of the temple is quite ornate. And if Jesus is doodling, writing, doing anything in it, it's not in order for it to be legible, right? There's no way you can write in the dust, a thin layer of dust in a well-trampled area on a multicolor mosaic tile floor, and it's going to be read. And so realizing that, as I hadn't before when reading this story, because I didn't have the archaeological input to sort of fill in that detail, I then asked, well, then what might the meaning be of this act of writing? And the answer that I came up with, that I explore in the book and also in an article in Biblical Archaeology Review, is that Jesus was making reference to, right, was pointing to the fact that there is in the law, right, even though it's a somewhat misogynistic law, but there was a law that sought to protect women from disgruntled husbands who, in some cultures and some societies, in some contexts, might have been able to simply accuse the wife of unfaithfulness and get rid of her that way. And so this law was created that was only applied to women, not to men, where the woman could be made to drink a mixture of dust from the temple floor and some ink that was taken off of a scroll with curses, and it was made to drink that, and then it was left up to God, right? And God would curse her, and she would miscarry, and so on and so forth, if she was guilty. And so the act of writing in the dust, right, echoes two elements of that ritual that's mentioned in the Book of Numbers. And that ritual was actually abolished sometime around this time period. The rabbi in whose time it is said to have been done was a contemporary of Jesus. And so if they got rid of it, right, on the one hand, it might be a good thing, but if you still have this wider patriarchal context, then you end up with cases like this one, where it should have been sort of left up to God. There was something, if she's said to have been caught in the act and yet she's on her own, then presumably, there's a pregnancy, right? And yet she's betrothed to be married. We know that because she is they say that she has to be stoned. And the Pharisees only applied the punishment of stoning where Torah specifically indicated that that was the punishment. And so if they say she must be stoned according to the law, that's cluing us in as readers and cluing Jesus in that she's a betrothed virgin. And she's been found to be pregnant, and the fiance doesn't recognize it as his. If she's a betrothed virgin, then certainly by our standards, if not by ancient ones, she is a minor, right? And this is at the very least, whatever's happened is statutory rape. But it may have been a family member, may have been something else. And so there's this problem that this betrothed girl is pregnant and the fiance doesn't recognize it as his. And there should be a way of getting her off the hook, right? So that she's not killed, right? She's already been subjected to something traumatic, presumably. And yet the law doesn't seem to leave a loophole. And the Pharisees have been looking for one and have not been provided with it by the parties involved. And so they bring it to Jesus. And what Jesus does is to find a principle that may actually be echoing that same ritual of the bitter waters that was applied to the wife when the husband was suspicious. He says, whoever's without sin, let them cast the first stone. And in the rabbinic tradition, when they get rid of this ritual of the bitter waters, they say that it doesn't work, right? It can't be applied to someone when you have husbands who are also themselves being unfaithful, right? And yet that was the issue, that husbands are being unfaithful and yet are subjecting wives to this. And so essentially Jesus says the same thing about stoning, right? Stoning doesn't apply, right, where there are others who are guilty in the community. And those who brought this woman to Jesus presumably were aware that she should be let off, that this should not be perpetrated against her. There's an injustice to the situation, and yet they don't have a recourse. And so Jesus comes up with something clever, but it's not the kind of solution you'd expect from a typical whodunit. And so what really was my takeaway from this story, this was the chapter, the writing of which was the most emotionally involved. I found myself really not believing that I had all these pieces to this puzzle of this woman's story, this young woman's story, this girl's story, And yet I had failed to put them together in the past because I trusted the males who were accusing her in the narrative. Your attention goes to Jesus, obviously, as readers of the Gospels, and never gave her the attention that she deserved in her own right to figure out what her story was. And yet I think that's actually the key to understanding why the story is in there, why Jesus does what he does, why he says what he says. And so that's where I ended up with this story that I think is a significant one. And I think encounters like this, right? Well, this may be only loosely based on something in the life of Jesus. Again, it's very hard to tell. But however close or distant to historical reality, I think cases like this made Jesus aware of inequality in the law and the way it was applied, and that some of Jesus' ethics regarding marriage, divorce, things like that, reflect an awareness of the fact that often at the hands of the law, even a law that many would treat as sort of God's law and divinely provided, those laws too often advantage men over women. And we see Jesus adopting a stance on the law that is open to seeing its humanness. Right? In the book project that I'm currently working on, I think he might have gotten some of that from John the Baptist. But I think experiences like this case being brought before him further taught him or reinforced what he'd already learned from his mentor in that regard.
What is so wonderful about this is it really flies in the face of people, specifically misogynists that read the Bible, that want to portray Jesus as this massively misogynistic person, and they don't, and people like that don't allow for the possibility that Jesus interacted with women and learned from women, and they're just too blind to see it.
I certainly agree with you. And I wrote the book because I think it's important for people to hear, right? I mean, there are some people who say, well, he haven't learned anything from anyone, male or female, because he was God, right? And there's that subset of people. But even those who take the human Jesus seriously, whether religious or non-religious people, sometimes say, well, he didn't learn from women, right? He maybe learned from John the Baptist, may have learned something from his parents, but then would mostly been maybe a teacher they organized for him, or a father, or things like that. And yet this, I think, comes through in the material. And as you said, it's challenging. And I love the fact that it's challenging. It challenged me, even having written this, thinking that this theme is an important one for others to hear. And so, hoping others would be challenged. Even so, going into it, thinking of myself as somebody who is trying to contribute positively to this, still had things that I needed to learn. I feel, with hindsight, things that challenged me, even where I was at the start of the project.
And just one last question. You mentioned that some may wonder how we can hope to say anything worthwhile about this topic when neither Mary's nor Joseph's parents appear as characters in the New Testament. We have two genealogies that claim to trace Joseph's genealogy found in Luke and Matthew, and they do not agree even on the name of Joseph's father. Could you talk about that?
Yes, so I included a chapter about Jesus' grandmother, and that's a somewhat questionable move. Somebody who's interested in the historical Jesus. I emphasize, in writing the book, that often we're given way less information about female characters, including female historical characters, than we would like. We're told less about women than about men. When men and women are included, we're less likely to be told the woman's name and other details like that. And so one risk is that the historian will perpetuate the silencing of these ancient women by saying, well, we don't have enough information, so we can't say anything. And so wanted to take what we could say and combine it with legitimate historical inference, generalities that we can draw upon as likely to be the case in the absence of other information, and piece together as much as I could. And so I do work with some of the traditions about Mary's mother, called Anna or Hannah, they write Anne in some sources. And on the one hand, a lot of that is legend, speculation, hagiography, fiction writing, right? Historical fiction writing. On the other hand, Jesus had grandparents, right? He had parents, he had grandparents. And asking what he could have learned across generations, I felt was important, even if we don't have as much information as we have, say, about Mary. We have information about Mary, but how much of it's historical, right? We have information about Mary and Martha of Bethany, about Mary Magdalene, but again, how much is historical? In the case of the grandmother, we have legends, so we can set some of those things aside and focus less on them, but there is intergenerational learning, right? You learn from your parents, things that they learned from their parents, and you may not even know that's the case, but it happens. And so I wanted to bring that into the picture, despite the paucity of the historical information that we had available that was concrete, because there were some general things that I felt could be said and could be said safely. And some of the traditions, even if it's only the names that are historical, are intriguing in as much as they may indicate that in addition to maybe on his father's side in particular having ancestry that came from Judah, from Judea, there may have been descendants, right, ancestry that was connected with the northern tribes that had lived in Galilee historically. And the possibility that there were other traditions besides those that predominated in Judah or Judea was also something I wanted to explore. And so speculating a bit more about Jesus' grandmother than I was happy to do in most of the other chapters gave me a chance to at least ask about some of those things, which I thought was worth doing.
Well, thanks for joining me today, James McGrath.
It's been a pleasure, Jacob. Thank you so much for your interest in the book. Thank you so much for always having good questions and interesting conversations. And yeah, looking forward to our next conversation.
Yep, same here. Thanks again.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.